Welcome back to Oleg Nesterov Brest channel. Finally the sun is shining, but today's topic will not be as cheerful, although informative, and namely primers. There are questions often asked recently regarding the use of various primers in car body repairs. Previously I had some lessons regarding this topic, but I will probably delete that video, as it was a little bit misleading. I have started to look deeper into the subject. I am discussing this with various specialists and process engineers, managers of major companies, and I find out lots of info for myself which I didn't know and which should be corrected. Today we will do just that. Today we'll discuss three types of primers. These are acrylic primer, which is filling the pores and leveling the surface, epoxy primer, acid primer, and as a special one we'll discuss 1K etching primer. First, let's discuss acrylic primer. Acrylic, which is also called a fill-in one, is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic property is vapor permeability. It does not absorb water as a sponge, but it collects vapor and moisture and forms microdrops of moisture on metal under the layers of primer. This moisture takes a long time to evaporate, as a result of which the metal corrodes. That is why acrylic primers are only used as fill-in ones and leveling ones. The next type of primer is epoxy. Epoxy primers are mainly used as moisture proofers. Such a primer does not let the vapor of moisture evaporate. It is also used when working with copper, zinc, aluminium and other metals. It's also used with cataphoretic primers. It has perfect adhesion properties and is used as moisture proofer. The third group of primers is 2K acid ones based on polyvinyl butyrol. They are also called phosphating or wash primers. They provide for chemical adhesion, and they also form a protective layer. Oftentimes we are unable to remove the corrosion left inside the pores, and in this case this primer will be of help to remove the corrosion. It transforms the remaining corrosion into a phosphate film, which will later on protect the metal from oxidizing. As a result of chemical reaction, the repaired surface is covered with lead or zinc, which are included in acid primer as chromates. Working with aluminium or zinc-plated surface or cataphoretic primer, in fact we can use any of the epoxy or acid primers, whichever is more convenient for you. And now let's discuss the most acute problem, and namely compatibility of primers. Acrylic primer may be applied over both epoxy and acid primers. An acid primer may be applied over any 2K hardened surface. If you don't manage to apply it over the bare metal. Epoxy primer, in its turn, may be applied over any 2K hardened surface. If you experience peeling off of paint, it is usually because of faulty primer thinning. For instance, many people use 646 solvent. This is absolutely wrong, as you need to use a specific thinner. Also, please note that if your epoxy primer is a 2K and it is used as 1:1, such primers do not require a thinner. They are already liquid. Let's discuss right off the bat the question which is often asked. Can you apply epoxy primer over acid, wash primer? Yes, you can, but it is not recommended. That's because epoxy primer destroys the properties of acid primer. Nothing will fall off, adhesion will be alright, but there is also not much sense in that. What's the point using acid primer in this case? That is why nowadays I use Zinccar solution, which is a rust solvent. I clean the surface with it, remove corrosion, and then apply epoxy primer. Here is also some info for you. If you apply acid primer and then cover it with acrylic primer above that, this coating would work, as acrylic primer does not destroy properties of acid primer. There are, of course, some technical data sheets which consider the possibility to cover acid primer with epoxy one, but you will have to dry the acid primer for at least 1.5 hours so that polymerization would take place. After the polymerization or drying, crystallization on molecular level, acid primer may be covered with any paint and lacquer coating, but the layer of epoxy primer is very thin, so all the defects would be seen. In reality, such layer would be too thin and we wouldn't be able to polish it. That is why we usually cover it with acrylic primer, wet on wet. So you may use acrylic primer as moisture proofer. Apply 2 layers, after which you level the surface, you sand it with sandpaper of different grades, say 240, 320. Putty also cannot be applied on bare metal without removing corrosion first. And strange as it may seem, you cannot apply it directly over acid primer, since the hardener contained in putty also dissolves a thin layer of acid primer. If you let acid primer dry for over 1.5 hours, then you may apply putty. But once again, we have, when our primer hardens, we have to leave scratch marks, that is, sand the surface. And this is not possible, because we will simply remove this layer. Why I don't work with acid primers? If you do decide to work with acid primer, in this case you apply acid primer on the required spot, cover it with 2 layers of acrylic primer, and then sand it. But try not to remove a layer of underlying acid primer. Otherwise your efforts will be useless. And then we put putty and cover it with epoxy primer. Then you dry it for 20 minutes, after which apply acrylic primer. Oftentimes I don't use epoxy primer over putty. As I said, acid primer, just like the epoxy one, may be covered with acrylic primer, wet on wet. Acrylic primer does not destroy neither epoxy nor acid primer. Acrylic primer will of course fill in all scratch marks, all defects which you may encounter on all underlying layers, because it's in fact a fill-in primer. It's also easily sanded, in contrast to acid and epoxy ones, and it's easy to work with. After which we do the painting. And the last ones are 1K primers. These are etching primers. They can be in aerosol cans or in 1-liter containers. They are mainly used for application on open areas of metal, putty, also widely used over spots which were sanded down to metal. As to me, I use this type of can. They are very good at removing such defects as contours. They are also used on the so-called multi-surfaces, like multicolored, different types of paint used on one surface. Can also be used on most paint and lacquer coatings, which is, by the way, very handy. That's why I use it more often these days. In fact, the datasheet recommends to use it in most of intermediate layers. That's because we often thin down primer with all sorts of solvents. And solvent is absorbed in putty, and when evaporating, it creates such defects as like contour. So you should keep this type of primer at all times in your garage.
Немножко отвлекает меня, может быть, постараюсь подсклеить передачу, чтобы все было ясно. И, наверное, эту тему я расположу.
To sum it up, I don't see any violations of requirements set out in datasheets, as I excluded the use of acid primer. You saw that I work with Zinker solution, after which I totally remove it, degrease the surface, and apply epoxy primer, which is then covered with acrylic one. The only thing that happens is I sometimes apply epoxy primer on metal and then I putty it, which, as you probably get from what I said earlier, simply neutralizes and making it acrylic. But I thoroughly clean the surface, therefore the corrosion does not appear later on. So these are the adjustments which you have to make.
Ссылочка будет под описанием видео. Смотрите, изучайте.
That's it for today. Let me wish everyone health, cheerful mood, and of course, best of luck and do
Бабла.
great.